What if one phone call shattered everything you thought you knew about your life? A loving wife, a steady marriage, and a simple routine, all torn apart by secrets darker than I ever imagined. Years before my life took an unexpected turn, I found comfort in the rhythm of my everyday routine. I spent weekends working on the house, unwinding with a beer, and playing hockey with my friends. My wife, Joy, and I had built a steady life together, one that wasn't without its challenges, but it worked for us. The first signs of trouble crept in quietly. It started with missed calls and late-night excuses, small enough to overlook. I told myself it was just the usual stresses of life. But as time passed, Joy's work trips became more frequent, and she grew distant. My gut whispered that something was off, yet I brushed it aside, unwilling to confront the thought. Then one winter night, everything shifted. That night, I was home alone, indulging in a marathon of war movies, The Dirty Dozen, Enemy at the Gates, Saving Private Ryan. It was a regular ritual whenever Joy was out of town, this time on a supposed work trip to Houston. I'd stocked up on snacks and was midway through Band of Brothers when my phone rang. Expecting to hear from my friend Paul, I grumbled and glanced at the screen. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Reluctantly, I answered, assuming it was Paul calling from someone else's phone. Instead, a woman's voice spoke. "This is Detective Phillips from Eagle Valley," she said. Her tone was calm but carried an edge that set me on alert. "Your wife, Joy, has been in a serious accident. She's at the hospital in Eagle Valley." At first, I was stunned. "That's impossible," I said, cutting her off. "Joy's in Houston." "When was the last time you spoke with her?" the detective asked, ignoring my protest. I hesitated. "Last night," I finally replied. She paused, then read off Joy's home address from the ID found with her. My stomach dropped. That was impossible, unless someone had stolen her wallet. "Someone must have taken her purse," I said, my voice growing defensive. "I want to press charges." The detective's next words were simple but firm. "We need you to come to the hospital and verify her belongings." Frustrated, I agreed. Grabbing my keys, I headed out for the 2-hour drive to Eagle Valley. The drive was anything but smooth. My mind raced with scenarios as the highway stretched endlessly in front of me. Perhaps someone had stolen Joy's ID and gotten into trouble. Or maybe it was Joy after all, but what could she be doing in Eagle Valley when she was supposed to be in Houston? A small, nagging voice in my head whispered darker possibilities. "How do you know she's really in Houston?" I pushed the thought away, but the voice wouldn't stop. "What if she's cheating?" It pressed. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. My mind churned with questions, fears, and doubts. The possibilities were endless, none of them comforting. And at the heart of it all was the sinking realization, I didn't truly know what to expect when I reached that hospital. "I'll leave her," I thought to myself. There was no way I could stay with a cheater. Ending a 10-year marriage felt like a drastic step, but I wasn't going to live the way my father did. I thought back to my parents. When I was 10, my mom started spending more time with her friends, and my dad became consumed by paranoia. One day, I overheard a devastating conversation. My mom confessed to having an affair. They tried to make it work, but my dad's reaction was anything but healthy. He grew controlling, made her quit her job, and demanded constant check-ins. Their relationship deteriorated, and they divorced not long after I graduated. My dad, once a brilliant detective, was never the same. He spiraled into bitterness and regret. I rarely speak to my mom now. It's hard to forgive her for what felt like the destruction of my dad. That pain left a mark on me, one I couldn't ignore. I also couldn't forget my brother, Daniel. When he caught his wife with another man, he reacted in the worst way imaginable. In a moment of rage, he killed them both. Now, he's serving time in prison, and our family bears the weight of that tragedy. I promised myself I wouldn't end up like either of them. If Joy was cheating, I had to find a way to handle it without destroying myself. I'd leave her, no question, but I wouldn't let her actions define my future. I'd rebuild, surround myself with good friends, and live my life on my own terms. As I neared the exit for Vale, my nerves hit a breaking point. Even the voice in my head, so quick to judge and analyze, went quiet. The tension made my stomach churn. I nearly pulled over to throw up but managed to push through. Finding the hospital was easy. I parked the car and stepped into the cold, brisk air, each step toward the entrance heavier than the last. I hadn't touched anything stronger than beer since Joy and I got married, but in that moment, I craved a bottle of Jack Daniels more than ever. At the information desk, I explained why I was there. After a quick glance at a clipboard, they gave me her room number. The nurse at the ICU entrance greeted me, her voice low but steady. "Your wife is sedated," she said. "She's badly injured and might not look like herself right now. I want you to be prepared before you go in." For a moment, I wasn't sure I was ready. My voice cracked as I forced myself to reply, "I'll be fine. Just let me in." What I saw in that hospital bed left me stunned. The woman's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, her body battered and bruised. Her height and build matched Joy's, but her face, it was unrecognizable. Did she hit every tree on the mountain? I asked, trying to mask my unease with a grim joke. The nurse frowned slightly. She wasn't skiing. Someone assaulted her and left her in an ambulance this morning. Assaulted? My mind scrambled for clarity. The words "knocked out" and "abandoned" echoed in my head. Faithful wives didn't end up in situations like this, did they? But I didn't have enough information to react. Was this my wife? If it was, what did this mean? The uncertainty was suffocating, and for now, all I could do was stand there, unable to decide how to feel. I told the nurse, "Maybe this will help," as she carefully lifted the blanket to reveal the woman's left thigh. There it was, the unmistakable tattoo. A tiny Jiminy Cricket inked on her inner thigh, something I hadn't seen on anyone else. Joy got it before our wedding, claiming it was a nod to her parents, Jim and Ian. I'd never entirely bought that explanation, but it didn't matter now. It was proof enough. This was Joy. Seeing her like that, battered, sedated, and fragile in a hospital bed, was gut-wrenching. The only other time I'd seen her in this much pain was the day we first met. It was after a Tool concert. My friends and I were hanging out by our van, a case of beer in the back for the after-party. A girl approached us, asking if she could grab a beer for her boyfriend. Chad, my friend, looked her over and said, "You can stay and have a drink, but we're not giving him one." She didn't push it and walked off. A few minutes later, we heard screams. I ran over and saw the same girl being struck by some guy, a small, wiry man with a chip on his shoulder. He was yelling, "Where's my beer, you witch," as he hit her. No one else stepped in, so I did. Grabbing him by the collar, I yanked him back, ignoring his threats. When he tried to swing at her again, I didn't think twice, I knocked him out cold. The girl, who I'd later know as Joy, was shaken. I helped her back to our van, where Chad had an ice pack ready. Security showed up and took the guy away. I wanted to report what had happened, but she stopped me. "You've done enough," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "No one's ever stood up to Garrett before. He'll probably head back to Wyoming now." Even in that moment, bruised and shaken, Joy was beautiful. Her gothic look, dark makeup, torn fishnets, was striking. As we drove her home, Chad leaned over and whispered, "I think she's into you." I shrugged it off, but later that night, I found a note in the van with her number on it, "Call me, Joy." 2 days later, I did. She sounded surprised but happy to hear from me. We talked for over an hour, and that evening, she called again. We stayed on the phone until midnight, trading stories and laughter. Our first date was that Friday. We went to a cozy Italian restaurant, followed by drinks and dancing at a dive bar. When I dropped her off at home, she asked with a playful grin, "Are you trying to get me into bed?" I smiled back. "There's plenty of time for that later. I like to wait a few dates. Keeps it more interesting." I kissed her goodnight, and it felt like the start of something real. A few days later, she invited me out for dinner. On the way back, she suddenly doubled over with stomach cramps and needed a bathroom. Luckily, my apartment was nearby, so I rushed her there. I didn't expect anything beyond letting her recover, but when she came out of the bathroom, she was wearing nothing but red underwear and high-heeled boots. "Take off your coat," she said, her voice confident and inviting. Needless to say, that moment was the start of a whirlwind romance, one that led to 10 years of marriage. But now, as I stood in that hospital room, staring at her broken body, all those memories felt distant, like echoes of a different life. The next morning, we woke up in my apartment, tangled in the sheets. We grabbed breakfast at a nearby diner, a cozy little place with sticky booths and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. After that, Joy and I didn't see each other again until Sunday dinner. As I dropped her off, she started complaining about something I can't even remember now. It feels so trivial compared to everything that's happened since. Fast forward to the present, I found myself in a police station in Vale, sitting across from Detective Phillips. She had led me into a small room, gesturing for me to take a seat. Across the room, her partner, Devon, moved to the opposite corner. "I'm going to record our conversation, Mr. Ree," Phillips said calmly. "Is that okay with you?" "Fine by me," I replied, trying to sound cooperative. Then, in an attempt to clear the air, I added, "Sorry about the prick thing." Phillips raised an eyebrow, looking both puzzled and amused. "Excuse me? When I called you a prick on the phone, I explained sheepishly, I thought you were my friend interrupting my me time." She exchanged a glance with Devon before replying, "What exactly is me time?" "It's when I walk my dog," I said, shrugging. "My friend Devon, a different Devon, not him," I gestured toward her partner, "usually interrupts me because his dog always needs to go out at the same time. He's a night owl." The detectives seemed to file that detail away, their expressions unreadable. "When did you last see your wife?" Phillips asked, redirecting the conversation. "Monday morning," I said. "I drove her to the airport for her flight to Houston." "Why was she going to Houston?" "For her company's annual meeting," I replied. "It's for their top performers. This would have been her third year attending." "And what does your wife do?" "She sells life insurance for TransUnited," I explained. "You know those annoying sales tactics where people sign up for a free kids information kit? My wife delivers it and tries to sell them life insurance. Some people get pretty upset about it." Phillips nodded, taking notes. "Did she meet with any clients in Vale?" "I have no idea," I said with a sigh. "She was supposed to be in Houston. Maybe her colleagues know more. I can give you a list of the people she usually works with." Devon sighed, exchanging a glance with Phillips. The room grew quiet for a moment before Phillips asked, "Do you think she could have been with someone in Vale?" I hesitated, the question landing heavily. I don't know," I admitted. Phillips and Devon seemed to be piecing things together, but I wasn't ready to draw my own conclusions. Later, when I was alone, I started trying to make sense of it myself. Joy's phone wasn't listed in the inventory of her belongings at the hospital or found in her purse. That seemed like a good sign, maybe she hadn't been in the worst of situations. A while back, my neighbor Steven developed a phone tracking app after his partner kept losing her phone. I'd installed it on Joy's phone, too, after she misplaced it a few times. Opening the app, I entered her number and saw that her phone was just 4 miles away. I started the car, following the directions. Eventually, I ended up at a small rental unit in Vale. Inside, it was clear someone had tried to clean up hastily. The bathroom sink had wet spots, as if someone had wiped it down with little care. The soap was in the shower, and the neatly stacked towels were damp at the bottom. Back in the bedroom, I pulled back the blanket on the bed. The sheets were wrinkled, showing signs that someone had slept there. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no torn fabric, but the scene left more questions than answers. Sitting at a small table in the corner of the room, I picked up Joy's phone and laptop, leaving her suitcase untouched. I spent the night in a chair by the table, unable to bring myself to rest in the bed. The next morning, after a bitter cup of coffee, I called Detective Phillips to report the key card I'd found on the nightstand. We arranged to meet at the station half an hour later. When I arrived, Phillips greeted me, her expression softened by sympathy. As I handed her the key card, she looked at me with a knowing gaze. "You look like a man whose world has collapsed," she said softly. And she wasn't wrong. I signed the documents at the hospital, visited Joy for what I knew would be the final time, and walked out with tears streaming down my face. It felt oddly acceptable to cry in a hospital. No one gives you a second look. Anywhere else, though, and I would have been the subject of curious stares. Driving out of Vale, I decided to call Jim, Joy's dad, to let him know what had happened. He was quiet on the other end of the line, his voice tinged with regret. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sight of my sister Beth's Jeep was a welcome relief. Inside, Piper, my ever-loyal Doberman, greeted me enthusiastically. Beth was sitting on the couch, and the moment she saw my face, she knew something was seriously wrong. Without waiting for an explanation, she wrapped me in a hug, and all the emotions I'd been holding back poured out. Over dinner, I shared what had happened at the hospital, my argument with Garrett, and my decision to end things with Joy. I recounted how Jim had tried to apologize, but I had already made up my mind. Joy and I were finished. Later that evening, I drove aimlessly, my thoughts swirling. Somehow, I ended up near Garrett's trailer. Before I had time to reconsider, I walked up and knocked on the door. Garrett answered, his face painted with a smug expression. That grin was the last straw. Without hesitation, I swung. My fist connected with his face, and the satisfaction of the blow spurred me on. I didn't stop after the first punch, or the second. When he crumpled to the floor, I kicked him a few more times, letting years of frustration and betrayal fuel every move. Amid the chaos, I noticed moving boxes stacked near the door. "Are you leaving town?" I asked flatly. Garrett groaned in response, and I landed one last kick for good measure. "Have a great trip," I said, leaving him in a heap. The next morning, I was approached by a police officer, but my involvement with a community hockey team sponsored by the police seemed to smooth things over. By Saturday, I was back on the ice, pushing myself hard in preparation for the upcoming season. When I got home, a cluster of notes was tacked to my door. Most were from Joy, pleading for a chance to explain, but one stood out. It was from Jim, apologizing for jumping to conclusions and asking me not to hold it against his daughter. I decided to call him. "It's fine, Jim," I said after hearing the guilt in his voice. "You reacted like any father would. You're not to blame for what Joy did." "Thanks, son," he replied, relieved. "Would you consider talking to her? Maybe hear her out?" "No, Jim," I said firmly. "I don't need her justifying betrayal as something normal. I'm done." Beth, ever the peacemaker in the family, tried to urge me toward reconciliation. She reminded me of how protective she had been of Mom after Daniel's choices tore the family apart. "I just don't want you to do something you'll regret later," she said softly. "Don't worry, Beth," I reassured her. "I'll get all the answers I need before making any decisions." When she left, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too restless to sleep. Piper curled up beside me, offering silent comfort. By morning, I was determined to get to the bottom of things. I distracted myself with the sports section over coffee until the clock struck 9 a.m. Then, I found myself sitting in the office of Joy's boss, Bernie Jaggs. "What can I do for you, Brian?" Bernie greeted me, his cheerful tone almost grating. He'd never bothered to get my name right. I ignored Bernie's cheerful demeanor and got straight to the point. "Can you tell me why my wife would leave the Houston convention and end up in Vail?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with frustration. Bernie's usual confidence faltered. He looked puzzled, but didn't offer any answers. After leaving his office, I spent hours at the hospital meeting with Joy's medical team. The focus was on her brain injury and the best course of treatment. Part of me wanted to walk away, to abandon the situation entirely, but I knew I didn't have the full story yet. Later, Jim and Yvonne arrived, just an hour before Joy's transfer from Vail to a larger facility. I told them what I had learned so far. Jim was visibly shocked, and Yvonne, her voice trembling, begged me not to make any final decisions yet. "Please," she said, "just wait until you know everything." I promised them I wouldn't harm Joy's recovery by leaving too abruptly, but in my heart, I wasn't sure if waiting was the right move. When Jim asked if I thought I could get through this, I answered honestly. "I don't know," I said. "I can't trust her anymore." Later, in a quieter moment of reflection, I replayed the words I wanted to say to Joy in my mind. I thought about how she had chosen to be with someone else, how I hadn't seen the signs sooner. We'd shared so many good times, but it seemed like she preferred men who couldn't handle their own issues, men who brought chaos into her life. I imagined confronting her with my frustration. "We agreed to be exclusive, so I won't get angry about you being with him before we officially committed. But I am angry I didn't see things more clearly sooner." And then I pictured her response, crying but defiant, as if asking, "Why are you still here?" I didn't have an answer, not one that felt satisfying. A few days later, I arrived at the sheriff's office for the next step in the investigation. Hugh, a local deputy, met me outside. "The Vail police will join via video," he explained. "You'll sit out of view, and remember, not a word. Anything you say could jeopardize the case." "I know," I replied. "I won't speak, and I won't attack him either." Hugh led me into the building, and I spotted Catherine Shepard, a face from my high school days. She'd been the girl who always seemed out of my league, and yet, here she was, even more stunning than I remembered. Hugh, ever the joker, nudged me. "Stop drooling, Zeke." Once inside, the investigation team gathered, Sheriff Jebb, Detective Phillips, and Detective Albert from Vail. They escorted Cal Davis, Joy's alleged lover, into the interrogation room. The routine questions began, basic information, his whereabouts, and I quickly realized something surprising. Cal didn't seem like the kind of man who would resort to violence. Yes, he had been sleeping with Joy, but he appeared more conflicted than malicious. Then came the question I had been waiting for. Detective Phillips asked, "Mr. Davis, where were you from Friday through Sunday?" Cal hesitated, then explained. "I was with Joy," he admitted. "But not in Vail the whole time. We spent Friday night together in Denver. After that, I drove back home. Joy stayed behind." Phillips pressed further. "Do you have proof of this?" "I don't know if it matters," Cal said, sighing deeply. "But I love her. I love my wife too, and she knows about my feelings for Joy. It's complicated." He began recounting how it all started. "When I interviewed Joy for my team, there was instant chemistry. It wasn't supposed to go anywhere, but one day, after a no-show presentation, we grabbed lunch near a military base. One thing led to another, and we ended up at a nearby hotel." His voice grew heavy with regret. "We both felt guilty after, but not guilty enough to stop, apparently." His words hit me like a brick. Guilt, chemistry, and choices they couldn't deny, those were the threads tying this all together. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about who Joy had become and whether I could ever trust her again. With a sarcastic edge, I responded to Cal, "It wasn't cheap or tasteless, Roger. Joy and I had something real. Tell her dad I'll be in touch. As I turned to leave, he called after me. You're not going to tell my wife, are you? I stopped and looked back. I don't even know your wife. Why would I hurt her? The guilt will eat you alive. Have fun living with that. Q, standing in the hallway, caught my attention. Sorry, Zeke, he said, shaking his head. We thought we had the guy. I sighed. I knew he wasn't the one who hurt her, but how did all of this go on right under my nose? Just then, we heard shouting from down the hall. Cal's wife, Katrina Shepard, stormed into the building, her voice echoing as she confronted him. You cheating piece of garbage. Don't come home, she screamed before slapping him across the face. As she passed me, her anger softened momentarily, and she pulled me into a tight hug. It was unexpected, but I didn't resist. Then she walked away, leaving Cal to stand there in shame. Later, I went back to the hospital. Jim was there, sitting in the waiting room, his head in his hands. When he saw me, he shook his head, his face full of disbelief. How long? He asked quietly. 6 years, at least, I replied. It seems like it started when she began selling insurance. I paused, thinking about the possibility of even more. But there might be more I don't know about. Jim sighed deeply. I can't believe my daughter did this. Me neither, I admitted. I wouldn't have married her if I'd known. I told him everything Cal had confessed. Jim listened, his face heavy with regret. I always wondered why she stopped taking photos on her trips, he muttered. She used to take pictures everywhere, even in Denver. Why didn't I notice? I shook my head. I didn't either. But none of us did. That evening, I was reviewing our bills and statements at home, trying to find any hidden signs I'd missed. Nothing seemed particularly out of place except one detail: Joy had been calling her friend Fiona far more often before her trips. Typically, it was once a month, but as the trips approached, the frequency spiked. It was too much to ignore. I suspected Fiona knew more than I did, but when I tried to call her, there was no answer. I also regretted not having Joy's phone to investigate further. Stephen, my tech-savvy neighbor, arrived later that night, looking exhausted but determined. He was holding Joy's laptop, and I knew he had found something. There's a bank account, he said, and a missing debit card. It wasn't in her belongings at the hospital, but I tracked some recent activity. He handed me a list of locations where the card had been used, one of which stood out immediately: Garrett's neighborhood. Thanks for the info, I said. You know, he added with a smirk, you should think about being a cop. You've got the instincts for it. I chuckled. I hear that a lot. We said goodnight, and after he left, I couldn't help but envy Stephen a little. He had a stable marriage, something I'd admired from afar. But I also knew from my own parents that being married to a cop wasn't easy. The next morning, I woke up determined to piece together the remaining gaps. My mind was spinning with possibilities as I prepared to dig even deeper into the tangled mess Joy had left behind. I took Piper outside for her morning walk and saw Stephen across the street. He waved, and I nodded back, feeling a mix of gratitude and exhaustion from the past few weeks. Everything was still swirling in my mind, but I knew one thing: I had to wait for Joy to wake up before anything could truly move forward. 2 weeks after coming out of her coma, Joy was ready to be questioned by the police. I followed Detective Phillips and Detective Albert down the hospital hallway, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. In the meantime, Garrett had been arrested. He'd tried to intimidate a bank employee into withdrawing money from a card issued to Joy Rigby. The bank had flagged the card as stolen, and security had detained him until Denver police arrived. To make matters worse for Garrett, his parole officer wasn't happy about him leaving Denver without permission, and he was promptly taken into custody. When Joy finally spoke to the detectives, she admitted to how things had spiraled with Garrett. She explained that he had pressured her into agreeing to secret monthly meetups, convincing her it wouldn't hurt me if I never found out. As I listened, I felt anger boil up inside me. She then detailed her affair with Cal, claiming they bonded over the thrill of being married to others. Their secret rendezvous at company events eventually led to deeper entanglements. Joy even admitted to buying me a trip to Miami once to ease her guilt, all while continuing to lie. Any doubts I might have had about serving her divorce papers evaporated in that moment. Phillips asked about Garrett's trailer, but I was already lost in thought, reflecting on how far my life had come. 5 years earlier, I had divorced Joy, thinking it would be a simple process. I couldn't have been more wrong. During the proceedings, my lawyer uncovered a secret bank account Joy had failed to disclose. I had always wondered how she managed to fund her lavish trips and gifts, and a chance encounter with Cal Davis gave me the answers. Cal explained that Joy had funneled unreported income, bonus checks and commissions, into the account with the help of an accountant and insider knowledge. While her actions had been deliberate, the funds technically came from legitimate sources. In a twist of fate, Joy never realized that I used her hidden account to pay off some of my own educational expenses. Later, an anonymous tip to the IRS triggered an audit. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but Joy wasn't so lucky. She ended up serving 6 months for tax evasion. As for Garrett, he was blamed for stealing Joy's money because he'd been caught with her bank card. With his prior history and a weak defense, he was convicted and sentenced to 35 years in prison for theft and parole violations. Meanwhile, Katrina divorced Cal, who left town to start a new life in Utah. A year and a half into my new career as a detective, my life had taken an unexpected turn for the better. One day, a new detective transferred to our department. All I knew about him was that he came from the north, but at a party near the station, I was surprised to see none other than Desiree Phillips. We started talking, and I realized how much I'd missed her no-nonsense demeanor. She later admitted that she had liked me from the moment we met in Vail but never thought I'd end up in law enforcement. Her transfer, she said, felt like a sign. That night marked the beginning of our relationship. A year later, we got married, and not long after, we welcomed our first child, Nora. My boss teased me endlessly about how quickly things had progressed, joking that I had gotten the detective pregnant on purpose. Now, as I look at my family, I can't help but feel grateful that I had found my way through the chaos to a life I could be proud of. Life, as unpredictable as ever, didn't slow down after Joy's confession and the whirlwind that followed. A year after the divorce was finalized, I thought I had left the chaos behind. I had Piper, my growing career as a detective, and a budding relationship with Desiree, which gave me a sense of stability I hadn't felt in years. But just when I thought the past was behind me, it reared its head in the most unexpected way. It all started with a package. I came home one evening, exhausted from a long day at work, to find an unmarked box on my doorstep. Curious, I brought it inside and carefully opened it. Inside was a single manila folder, thick with papers, and a note that simply read, "You missed something." My stomach sank as I flipped through the documents. Bank statements, emails, and photos painted a new, darker picture of Joy's secret life. It wasn't just affairs or hidden accounts, it was money laundering. Somehow, during her time with Garrett and Cal, Joy had become embroiled in a scheme that went far beyond anything I had imagined. The name at the center of it all jumped out at me, Damian Cross. The name rang a bell, though I couldn't place it immediately. A quick search in our department's database revealed him to be a suspected criminal mastermind, someone we had been investigating for years but had never been able to pin down. Joy's connection to him was shocking, but what chilled me to the core was a file tucked at the back of the folder, a list of names, including mine. I immediately called Desiree. "We've got a problem," I said, summarizing the contents of the package. "Damian Cross?" she asked, her voice tense. "He's dangerous, Zeke. If Joy's tied up with him." "I know," I said, gripping the folder tightly. We need to figure out how deep this goes. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and quiet meetings with Desiree and a small, trusted team at the station. We discovered that Joy had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, been laundering money through her secret bank account for years, and Damien Cross was using her as a pawn. The situation escalated when Damien himself reached out. I received an email late one night. "You're asking the wrong questions, detective. Stay out of it, or you'll lose more than you can imagine." The message was accompanied by a grainy photo of Piper. It became personal. Desiree and I ramped up our efforts, working day and night to unravel Damien's operation. We tracked down old contacts of Joy's, including Fiona, who admitted she had been paid to keep quiet about Joy's dealings. The break in the case came when Stephen, my tech-savvy neighbor, cracked Damien's network. His app revealed a safe house just outside of Denver that Damien was using as a hub for his operations. The raid on the safe house was intense. SWAT teams moved in, and the ensuing standoff felt like it lasted hours. Damien's men were well armed, but we had the advantage of surprise. In the chaos, I found myself face to face with Damien Cross. He was calm, eerily so, as he stood in the dimly lit room where he'd orchestrated his schemes. "You must be Zeke," he said, smiling faintly. "You've caused me quite a bit of trouble." "Your time's up," I replied, leveling my gun at him. "Is it?" he asked, tilting his head. "Or is yours just beginning?" Before I could respond, he lunged, and we fought in a brutal, chaotic struggle. I managed to subdue him just as backup arrived, but his parting words chilled me. "This isn't over, detective," he hissed as they cuffed him. "You'll see. You're part of this story now." With Damien's arrest, the operation unraveled quickly. Joy's involvement came to light, but with her previous conviction and time served, the authorities didn't pursue additional charges. Instead, she vanished, cutting all ties with everyone, including Jim and Yvonne. As for me, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Desiree and I focused on building our family, and Piper remained my steadfast companion. Still, Damien's words haunted me. He was right, this wasn't over. Every case I took from then on seemed to have threads of his influence, subtle reminders that I was now tangled in a web much larger than myself. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that I won't back down. Whatever comes next, I'll be ready.